Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most haunting love stories, the tragic myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before fame, before heartbreak, and long before anyone thought descending into hell for love was a good idea, there was Orpheus, the original rock star of ancient Greece. Born to Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, and Apollo, the god of music, Orpheus had no choice but to be talented. It was practically genetic. While other children learned how to hurl stones at goats, little Orpheus was busy discovering that plucking strings could make people cry, which, in ancient terms, was the peak of sophistication. From the moment he strummed his first lyre, the world collectively decided to stop and listen. Trees leaned closer, rivers changed their flow to match his rhythm. Even lions reportedly stopped mid-mauling to hum along. The man could make rocks emotional, and not just metaphorically. Stones would roll toward him as if desperate for front-row seats. It was as if nature itself had a subscription to Orpheus Premium. Apollo, ever the proud dad, gifted him a golden lyre that made every mortal bard look like a village drunk with a flute. And soon, Orpheus wasn't just good, he was divine-level good. Imagine someone who could outplay Mozart, outsing Freddie Mercury, and still manage to look mythologically handsome while doing it. The gods adored him, mortals worshipped him, and the underworld, well, they were about to get their turn. But talent, as history never fails to prove, is a dangerous thing. It attracts envy, obsession, and the occasional snake-related tragedy. For now, though, Orpheus lived in harmony with the world, plucking his lyre under olive trees while satyrs slow-clapped in admiration. His songs weren't merely melodies, they were emotional ambushes. Farmers forgot to harvest, hunters forgot to hunt, and philosophers forgot what they were arguing about. Every strum told a story, every note promised an escape from the dullness of mortal life. He could make grief sound poetic and heartbreak sound like an exclusive experience. The ancient world had found its celebrity, and unlike most mortals, Orpheus seemed immune to arrogance. At least until love entered the stage, because no matter how divine the music, nothing hits harder than a well-timed tragedy. He didn't know it yet, but somewhere beyond the wild applause, fate was already tuning her strings. Eurydice didn't enter Orpheus's life like a thunderbolt or divine omen, more like the world's most graceful accident. She was a nymph, which in Greek mythology meant beautiful, ethereal, and almost certainly destined for disaster. One day she was dancing through the meadows, barefoot and carefree, and the next she was making the most talented musician in history forget what hunger, sleep, and self-respect were. The meeting itself wasn't some grand affair. No lightning, no choirs of angels, just a man with a lyre, and a woman who didn't immediately run away from the sound of it, which, by ancient standards, was romance. Legend says that when Orpheus first played for her, the wind stopped moving, and even Zeus paused mid-affair to eavesdrop. For the first time, the great musician found himself speechless, which, ironically, was terrible for his lyrics, but great for love. The two were inseparable. Orpheus played, Eurydice listened, and the world collectively gagged at how perfect they were. They made everyone around them look bad. Shepherds forgot their flocks, poets threw out their work, and gods probably took notes for their next tragic experiment. Theirs was the kind of love that poets would later romanticize, and everyone else would quietly resent. Naturally, the wedding was divine chaos. All the forest creatures attended, deer, birds, even a few mildly confused centaurs. The muses sang, the wine flowed, and for one brief, perfect evening, happiness seemed like it might actually last longer than a Greek myth normally allows. But the gods have a cruel sense of humour. They see love not as something sacred, but as an opportunity for creative punishment. Somewhere in the shadows, fate was already bored and sharpening her knives. Eurydice, radiant in her wedding veil, smiled at Orpheus as he strummed a song about eternal devotion. A dangerous choice of theme in a culture where mortals rarely lived long enough to make good on it. Their love burned so brightly it practically begged for tragedy. Because in Greek mythology, the moment things go perfectly, the universe clears its throat and says, "All right, now let's ruin everything." And for Orpheus and Eurydice, the first note of that ruin was already humming beneath the strings of his lyre. Tragedy in Greek mythology has a peculiar rhythm. It usually begins with someone being too happy, which the gods apparently find offensive. Orpheus and Eurydice were blissfully married, dancing through meadows, laughing under olive trees, and generally behaving like two people who had clearly never read a Greek myth. It was only a matter of time before nature, ever the jealous spectator, decided to intervene. It happened on what should have been a perfectly ordinary afternoon. Eurydice wandered into a field of wildflowers, perhaps humming one of Orpheus's latest hits. Somewhere nearby lurked Aristeus, a minor shepherd with major ego problems. Convinced that no meant try harder, he chased her through the tall grass with all the grace of a drunken goat. In her desperate attempt to escape, Eurydice stepped on the one thing worse than a bad suitor, a viper. The snake struck fast, and the meadow went quiet. Eurydice fell, her veil brushing the petals as she collapsed. One bite. That was all it took. By the time Orpheus arrived, guided by the echo of her final scream, the world had already dimmed. She lay still, her beauty untouched, as if even death hesitated to claim her too roughly. The lyre slipped from his hands. For the first time, silence was louder than song. It said that Orpheus tried to sing her back to life, as if death might pause, tap its foot and reconsider. But the underworld has no taste for melody. Eurydice was gone, and all that remained was a man, a lyre, and the kind of grief that doesn't fade, but ferments. The world, ever indifferent, carried on. The birds resumed singing, the rivers continued flowing, and Aristeus went back to pretending he was relevant. But Orpheus, he wandered. His songs changed. Gone were the joyful tunes that made even stones weep with happiness. Now every note bled sorrow. The forests grew quiet, not out of awe, but pity. And somewhere in the shadows, Hades smiled faintly, not out of cruelty, but because he knew. No matter how divine the music, some hearts are destined to play their masterpiece only after breaking. The first act of Orpheus's legend was over. The descent was about to begin. Grief does strange things to mortals. Some drink, some pray, and some decide to march straight into the underworld with a musical instrument. Orpheus, naturally, picked the third option. Mourning Eurydice, he wandered aimlessly for days, strumming songs so mournful that even the trees looked uncomfortable. When he finally stopped crying long enough to think, he made a decision that could only be described as either heroic or clinically insane. He would bring her back. The ancient Greeks called this sort of thing hubris. The gods called it excellent entertainment. Armed with nothing but his lyre and an alarming amount of emotional damage, Orpheus approached the mouth of Hades, a cavern so dark it made tax season look cheerful. Most mortals would have turned back. Orpheus, however, had the kind of confidence that only love and poor decision-making can create. He played as he entered, each note echoing through the gloom like a heartbeat in a tomb. The shadows paused. The ghosts, usually busy moaning about their own tragedies, went quiet to listen. The ferryman Charon, infamous for charging even dead people a fee, forgot to ask for payment and just waved him across the river Styx. If Spotify had existed, Orpheus would have been trending in every realm. Past the river, Cerberus, the monstrous three-headed dog of hell, perked up. Normally, he preferred his snacks screaming, but Orpheus played a tune so gentle that the beast yawned, curled up, and took the most peaceful nap in underworld history. It was official. The man could charm anything with a pulse, or in this case, without one. As Orpheus descended deeper, even the Furies, ancient spirits who specialized in making people regret being born, wiped their tears and asked for an encore. The dead, long deprived of beauty, found something almost living in his music, and at the heart of it all, sitting on thrones carved from shadow and regret, were Hades and Persephone. They watched the mortal approach, his face hollow, his hands trembling over divine strings. In the silence that followed, Orpheus bowed and lifted his lyre one final time. He had come to bargain with death, not with words, but with song. And for once, death would listen. Convincing Hades to do anything out of kindness was about as likely as convincing Zeus to stay faithful. Yet here stood Orpheus, one mortal, one lyre, and a grief so raw it could have cracked marble. Hades, the ultimate bureaucrat of the afterlife, looked unimpressed. Persephone, on the other hand, leaned forward, eyes bright with something between pity and curiosity. It wasn't every day a man walked into hell and requested a refund. Orpheus didn't speak. He simply played. The first note trembled through the chamber, fragile but defiant. Then came another, and another. A melody so pure that even the tormented souls of Tartarus paused mid-scream. Rivers of fire slowed their flow, the shadows straightened their backs, and even Hades' crown tilted slightly, as if trying to catch every sound. It was music not of rebellion, but surrender. A hymn to love's arrogance and its futility. Persephone wept openly, her tears blooming into ghostly flowers across the obsidian floor. Hades pretended not to notice, but the corners of his mouth twitched, the godly equivalent of bawling. Every string Orpheus plucked told the story of Eurydice's laughter, her sudden silence, and the unbearable echo that followed. By the time he struck the final chord, the underworld had forgotten its misery. Even the dead, briefly, remembered what it felt like to live. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Hades exhaled, a sound that could have been mistaken for the world ending. "Fine," he muttered, like a man agreeing to lend his car to someone he doesn't trust. "You may have her back, but under one condition: she follows behind you, and you must not look back until you both reach the world above." It was classic Hades, the kind of loophole-riddled mercy that would make a lawyer blush. Orpheus nodded, grateful and doomed in equal measure. As Persephone guided Eurydice's shade toward the path of light, Hades slouched back into his throne, muttering something about mortals and their theatrics. The deal was struck, the music had worked, and the impossible had been granted. All Orpheus had to do was walk, and resist the single most human instinct of all, to look back. What could possibly go wrong? The deal sounded simple enough. Walk straight out of hell without glancing back. But simplicity has never been the strong suit of mortals, especially ones armed with both trauma and curiosity. Orpheus began his ascent with Eurydice's faint footsteps echoing behind him. Light, almost ghostly, as if she were more memory than matter. The tunnel wound upward through layers of shadow, and every step felt like wading through grief made solid. For the first few minutes, Orpheus was the model of discipline. Eyes forward, jaw clenched, playing mental chess against temptation. But the underworld wasn't about to make this easy. The silence was maddening. No whispers, no movement, just the faint, uncertain sound of someone who might, or might not, still be following. He wanted to speak, to say her name, but the gods had neglected to mention whether talking counted as looking back, and Hades was the type to exploit fine print. So he pressed on, sweating like a sinner in confession. Every few steps, his imagination betrayed him. What if she wasn't there? What if it was all some elaborate divine prank? After all, the gods had form. They turned people into trees for less. The light from the mortal world began to shimmer faintly ahead, a distant halo of hope. He could almost taste freedom, sunlight, wind, the scent of grass. But with each step, the sound behind him grew quieter, as if Eurydice were fading, slipping further away. Doubt dug in its claws. Maybe she'd tripped. Maybe Hades had lied. Maybe love, for all its songs and poetry, was just a cruel trick with better marketing. The tunnel narrowed, the air thinned, and the silence became unbearable. Orpheus stopped. His heart hammered like a drumbeat in a funeral procession. Just one look, he thought. Just one, to be sure. And there it was. The fatal thought that every tragic hero before and after would repeat in one form or another. What's the worst that could happen? He turned his head ever so slightly. The answer, as it turned out, was everything, and then he did it. The one thing literally everyone, alive or dead, told him not to do. Orpheus turned around. One flick of the neck, one twitch of mortal impatience, and the universe collectively face-palmed. Behind him stood Eurydice, pale as moonlight, her hand reaching toward him. For a fleeting second, they locked eyes. The kind of moment poets write about for centuries, and therapists charge by the hour to unpack. Then she began to fade. Slowly, like mist caught in sunlight. Her expression didn't scream anger or betrayal. Just that gentle, tired sadness of someone who knew this was how it would end. Orpheus lunged forward, arms outstretched, but his hands met only air. She whispered his name. Or maybe it was just the sound of the wind retreating. And then she was gone. Pulled back into the dark like a curtain closing on a tragedy everyone saw coming. The silence afterward was surgical. No music, no echo, just the quiet realization that he had outsmarted himself. Even the gods probably paused their ambrosia to watch the replay. Somewhere, Hades was muttering, "I literally said don't look back," while Persephone sighed, "Mortals, every time." Orpheus stood frozen, staring at the spot where she vanished. The light ahead no longer seemed like salvation, just an insult. Daylight mocking a man who'd lost everything twice. He sank to his knees, the lyre slipping from his grasp. The notes that once could charm gods now sounded hollow, like a promise broken mid-song. Some versions of the story say he begged Hades for another chance. Others claim he screamed so beautifully that even the Furies turned away in shame. But there were no second bargains. The contract was void. Eurydice belonged to the underworld once more, and Orpheus, well, he belonged to his own mistakes. As he stumbled back toward the living world, the shadows didn't jeer or whisper. They simply let him go, like an audience that's grown weary of tragedy, but can't deny it was beautifully performed. Love had conquered neither death nor human doubt, just proven that both were equally stubborn. And somewhere in the distance, the last note of his song finally died. When Orpheus finally emerged from the underworld, he wasn't triumphant. He looked like someone who had rage-quit life halfway through. The sunlight hit his face, but it didn't warm him. It just reminded him of how cold everything else had become. His lyre, once the most envied instrument in Greece, now felt like a cruel joke. A thing built for harmony in a world that clearly preferred chaos. The people who saw him said he was changed. Gone was the golden boy who made the trees sway and the rivers hum along. What walked among them now was a hollowed-out echo, a man dragging the weight of two deaths, one of a wife and one of a dream. He played sometimes, but the melodies were strange, part mourning, part accusation. Birds fell silent, farmers forgot to move, and somewhere a satyr muttered, "Well, that killed the vibe." Word spread, as it always does when misery is involved. They said Orpheus's music could now make the living envy the dead. He sang of loss, of love's arrogance, of the moment when faith blinked and eternity slipped away. It wasn't pretty, but it was unforgettable, like watching a shipwreck in slow motion with a haunting soundtrack. Eventually, he stopped playing altogether. The lyre hung at his side like an old friend he no longer trusted. People whispered that he had gone mad, but the truth was simpler. He had seen what lay beneath the world's surface, and it wasn't enlightenment. it was bureaucracy with candles. He'd challenged death, and death had given him a perfectly reasonable no. In the quiet that followed, Orpheus wandered. He didn't perform, didn't eat much, didn't talk to anyone. Even the gods, usually quick to meddle, left him alone, perhaps out of pity, or perhaps because his failure was the kind of poetic irony they couldn't improve upon. The world returned to its rhythm, pretending not to notice the man who had once made it dance. But every now and then, someone swore they could hear faint music drifting through the hills, the echo of a song that had once tamed the wild, now mourning itself. The greatest musician alive had finally discovered the sound of silence. Grief eventually curdles. At first, it's poetic. Tragic songs, moonlit wandering, a touch of divine melancholy. But after a while, it just starts to smell bad. Orpheus had passed the poetic phase. He'd entered the talking to trees era of heartbreak. He refused all company, avoided festivals, and developed the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had not only seen the afterlife, but received a 1-star review from it. People tried to help. His friends, assuming he still had any, invited him to gatherings, where he'd sit quietly in the corner until someone inevitably said, "Play us a song." Then he'd strum one chord that made everyone question their life choices and leave. The Muses, his divine aunts, even staged what was essentially an ancient Greek intervention. It didn't work. Orpheus thanked them politely, then went right back to composing songs with titles like Death, My Only Audience. The gods, usually so fond of drama, began to lose interest. Even Apollo stopped checking in, muttering something about artistic burnout. The villagers, on the other hand, found him terrifying. Children whispered that he could summon ghosts. Adults said he'd been cursed. In truth, he was just profoundly miserable, which in ancient Greece was almost fashionable. He took to the woods, preferring the company of rocks and birds to that of mortals. Animals listened, though they didn't dance anymore. They just sat quietly, as if attending a very long funeral. His songs had lost their power to charm. They only lingered like smoke. Some say even his shadow began keeping its distance, and then there were the women, or rather, the ones he avoided. After Eurydice, Orpheus swore off love entirely. Depending on which ancient gossip you believe, this offended quite a few admirers. Greek women were not accustomed to rejection, especially from someone whose voice could make a boulder tear up. Rumours spread that he hated all women. Others said he simply feared them, which, considering his track record, was perfectly understandable. Isolation turned into something stranger. The line between genius and madness blurred. His music became unpredictable, bursts of beauty swallowed by chaos. The man who once charmed the world now sang only to the void, and the void, as always, was a loyal listener. Death finally found Orpheus. Though, to be fair, he'd been rehearsing for it for years. By the time it arrived, he wasn't so much living as dramatically existing. The end came, as it often does in Greek mythology, via a misunderstanding and a mob of women. Specifically, the Maenads, Dionysus's famously unstable fan club. They were in the middle of one of their divine raves, drinking wine, tearing animals apart, and generally redefining chaos. Orpheus, as usual, was nearby playing a haunting tune to a tree. The Maenads, stumbling upon him, asked for a song they could dance to. Something lively, they said, something fun. But Orpheus, still emotionally allergic to happiness, refused. Instead, he strummed another of his slow-motion heartbreak ballads, probably titled something like Eurydice, Revisited, Again. Now, the Maenads were not known for patience or restraint. Their wine-to-blood ratio was about 4-1. When he refused to join their party, they did what any self-respecting Dionysian cult would do. They ripped him to shreds. Ancient sources are split on whether it was out of rage, drunken confusion, or just bad rhythm, but the result was the same. The greatest musician in Greece was reduced to a tragic pile of limbs and irony. His severed head, still attached to the lyre, floated down the river Hebrus, continuing to sing as it drifted. Witnesses claimed the sound was beautiful, eerie, mournful, and somehow insultingly on-brand. The Muses, horrified but probably not surprised, gathered the remains and gave him a proper burial, while Apollo turned his lyre into a constellation. Nothing says, "you messed up," quite like being immortalized as a sad cluster of stars. As for the Maenads, Dionysus punished them by turning them into trees, proving once again that in Greek mythology, the best-case scenario after a wild night out is photosynthesis. And so ended the life of Orpheus, a man who could move the hearts of gods but couldn't stop his own from breaking. He'd outplayed death, defied divinity, and turned misery into art. But in the end, it wasn't love or fate that destroyed him. It was the ancient equivalent of bad concert etiquette. And so, after an appropriately melodramatic death, Orpheus finally joined the only audience that couldn't walk out on him: the dead. One moment he was floating down the river in pieces, the next he was standing, whole again, in the underworld. It was a reunion tour no one had asked for, but one fate had booked anyway. Eurydice was there, of course, waiting in the soft half-light of Elysium. No snakes, no gods, no dramatic conditions attached, just eternity and a mildly confused husband who'd taken the scenic route. When she saw him, she smiled that same quiet smile, the one that had once made Apollo's lyre sound off-key. She didn't scold him for the whole looking back and dooming us both forever thing. She just said, "You took your time," which, coming from someone who'd been dead for years, was fair. Orpheus, for the first time in what felt like several centuries, laughed. Not the hollow, tragic kind of laugh he'd perfected on Earth, but the genuine, relief-soaked kind that sounds like a song rediscovering itself. There was no stage now, no crowd, no gods judging the rhythm. Just two souls who had finally outlasted every rule written against them. The legends say they wandered the Elysian fields side by side, speaking little, because words had already failed them once. Sometimes Orpheus played, not to charm or impress, but simply because music was how he breathed. And when he played, even the air seemed to shimmer, as if the world itself had decided to stop punishing them for loving each other. Above them, the living world moved on. Poets immortalized their tragedy, sculptors carved their sorrow, and philosophers argued over whether love was worth the paperwork. Meanwhile, in the calm gardens of the afterlife, Orpheus and Eurydice did what they'd always wanted to do. Nothing. No bargains, no conditions, no turning back. It's funny, really. He spent his life chasing eternity, and only found it once he stopped trying. Maybe that's the moral the gods were after all along. You can't cheat death, but you can occasionally duet with it. And somewhere, faintly echoing through the underworld, the last note of Orpheus's lyre still hums, perfectly in tune at last. Before the age of decay and frost, the world basked in an eternal spring. Every valley bloomed, every breeze carried the scent of life renewed. Rivers hummed softly under skies without clouds, and no mortal had yet learned the word winter. In this timeless season wandered Persephone, maiden of blossoms, daughter of Demeter and Zeus. Her laughter was said to make flowers bloom faster, and her footsteps left trails of green behind. She was the pulse of the earth itself, vibrant and unblemished by sorrow. Demeter, the goddess of harvest, guarded her daughter fiercely. She had built for her a world of gentle sunlight and safe meadows, where no shadow dared intrude. The two were inseparable, mother and child, creator and creation. Together they kept the cycle of growth alive. But such perfection, as the poets would later sigh, never lasts. Even Olympus grows bored of harmony. Far below the golden clouds and silver seas, another god watched this radiant figure from the depths of his lonely kingdom. Hades, ruler of the underworld, sat on a throne carved of obsidian, surrounded by shades who offered neither laughter nor love. His was a realm of silence, ordered, dutiful, but utterly devoid of warmth. The living feared his name, though he brought them justice after death, and for ages he had ruled without longing, until he saw her. Persephone's beauty pierced through the cracks of the world like sunlight leaking into a tomb. To Hades, she was not just a maiden, she was balance itself, a counterpoint to his darkness. Yet how does one who governs the dead speak to life incarnate? He knew no courtship, no poetry. He only knew possession. Up above, the gods feasted and laughed, oblivious to the brewing tension below. Even Zeus, father of both, felt the quiet pull of inevitability, but chose silence, the kind of silence that would one day split the earth open. For now, the world still sang with spring. Persephone wove crowns of lilies and narcissus, untroubled by destiny. But somewhere beneath her dancing feet, the ground began to stir, not yet cracking, just whispering her name. The gods were watching, the seasons were waiting, and paradise had already started to end. Hades, the invisible one, ruled a kingdom unseen by mortal eyes, a vast expanse of shadow, mist, and memory. The underworld was not cruel, it was precise. Every soul had its place, every shade its silence. Yet for all his power, Hades was a prisoner of loneliness. His brothers, Zeus and Poseidon, had divided the cosmos between them, the sky, the sea, and the soil below. Hades had drawn the short straw, the realm of the dead. No cheers, no sunlight, no love. Only the echo of lives that once were. In that endless twilight, Persephone became his fixation. He saw her first in the mortal fields. A figure gleaming among mortals and nymphs, her laughter rippling like a bell in a mausoleum. To Hades, she was not merely beautiful, she was unbearable. The way light danced on her hair mocked his darkness. The way she gathered blossoms defied the stillness he ruled. And so he watched, not with lust, but with an ache deeper than hunger. It was not desire as men know it, but the yearning of night for dawn. Still, even gods require permission to act. Hades sought out Zeus upon Olympus, his tone steady, but his eyes hollow. "Brother," he said, "the world above teems with life. I wish for a queen to rule beside me. Let it be Persephone." Zeus, master of compromise, considered the request. Demeter's daughter was precious, but her mother's power had grown vast, and Zeus feared the balance of Olympus tipping toward her. And so he answered not with words, but with silence, a silence that Hades interpreted as consent. That silence was enough to set the myth in motion, for the god of death is not accustomed to waiting. He began to plan, not with malice, but with inevitability. In his mind, Persephone's laughter no longer belonged to the surface world, it belonged to the deep. In the days that followed, the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. The meadows still bloomed, the sun still shone, yet beneath them all the god of the dead prepared his chariot of gold and obsidian. Love, or what passed for it in the underworld, was about to shatter the eternal spring. It was an ordinary morning, or as ordinary as mornings could be in a world that had never known decay. The sky was soft as milk, the breeze thick with scent. Persephone wandered across the meadow, her laughter tumbling through the grass like a melody without end. Nymphs followed her, their baskets overflowing with blossoms, each bloom competing for her touch. Among them, a voice, faint and curious, whispered her name. She thought it was the wind. Then she saw it, a single flower standing apart from the rest. A narcissus, white and gold, its petals trembling as though alive. It was not merely beautiful, it was divine. Even the air around it shimmered, heavy with enchantment. Persephone hesitated for a moment, the faintest ripple of unease running through her. But curiosity, that ancient curse of gods and mortals alike, pulled her closer. She reached out. The moment her fingers brushed the petals, the earth roared. The meadow split open in a violent tremor that sent birds screaming into the sky. Soil churned like waves, and from the fissure below rose a chariot of gold drawn by 4 black horses. Their manes burned with shadow. At their reins stood Hades, the king of the dead, his crown of obsidian catching the light like a wound. Before Persephone could cry out, he reached for her, not roughly, but with the desperate finality of a god who has waited too long. The ground swallowed them both. The chasm sealed, and silence fell over the meadow once more. The nymphs screamed her name until their voices failed. All that remained was the crushed Narcissus, glowing faintly in the dirt. The world above continued as if nothing had happened, but something profound had changed. The air grew stiller. The light seemed less forgiving. The endless spring had lost its rhythm. Some say the Narcissus was planted by Gaia herself, at Zeus's quiet command, a trap laid in beauty's disguise. Others claim Hades crafted it from his own longing, the first flower ever born of darkness. Whatever the truth, the moment Persephone touched it, innocence ended. The goddess of spring had vanished beneath the earth, and paradise had begun to mourn. When Persephone vanished, the world did not notice at first. Flowers still bloomed, rivers still sang, and the winds still whispered through olive groves. But Demeter felt the absence instantly, a silence in her heart so sharp it cut through divinity. The mother of all harvests paused mid-step, sensing a tear in the fabric of creation. She called her daughter's name once softly, expecting laughter in reply. None came. Panic followed. Demeter abandoned Olympus and roamed the mortal world disguised as a grey-haired woman, her golden crown traded for dust. She wandered from field to field, torch in hand, searching through the night. She questioned shepherds, fishermen, even the waves of the sea. Each answered with the same empty stare. Days turned to weeks, and the goddess of plenty grew gaunt with despair. The earth began to mirror her sorrow. Crops wilted beneath her tears. Seeds refused to sprout. Once verdant valleys turned skeletal, their rivers shrinking into mud. Mortals prayed, begging the heavens for mercy, but no rain fell. The famine spread, quiet at first, then roaring like a divine curse. The balance of the world trembled. At last, Demeter confronted Helios, the all-seeing sun. He tried to avert his gaze, but she seized his light and demanded truth. "Tell me who took her," she thundered, "or your sky will burn black." Helios, bound by his nature to see all things, confessed. "It was Hades, lord of the dead. He rose from the earth and carried your daughter to his realm below. And goddess, Zeus permitted it." That final revelation broke her. Demeter's sorrow curdled into fury. She cursed Olympus, vowing that not one blade of grass would grow until her daughter was returned. Fields became deserts, orchards skeletons. The fragrance of the earth died. Even the gods began to feel hunger. Zeus, pressured by mortal prayers and divine unrest, finally took notice. The king of gods could ignore many things, but not starvation. His world was unravelling, and he knew its source. Meanwhile, beneath all that ruin, Persephone sat in the dim halls of Hades, unaware that her mother's grief had frozen the living world. Spring was gone, and for the first time in creation, winter was born. Far beneath the weeping earth, Persephone awoke in darkness. The air was thick with silence, the kind that presses against the soul. She expected chains, torment, fire, whatever terrors mortals imagined of the underworld. Instead, she found stillness and symmetry. The realm of Hades was not cruel, only cold. Rivers of memory flowed through caverns vast as night itself, and pale shades drifted like mist across the black fields of asphodel. Hades watched her from his throne of obsidian, his expression unreadable. He did not revel in her fear. He seemed almost uncertain of his own victory. "You are safe here," he said, his voice low and hollow as an echo. Persephone did not answer. Her defiance was silent, but it burned bright enough to warm the void around her. Days passed, or what passed for days in a land without sun or moon. Servants of shadow brought her jewels carved from the bones of mountains and robes woven from starlight caught between realms. She refused them all. She longed only for light, for her mother's touch, for the hum of bees and the smell of tilled soil. Yet in moments of quiet, she could not deny the strange allure of this world. The dead whispered to her, not in torment, but in reverence. They told her their names, their loves, their regrets, and she listened. Something began to shift. Flowers, small and fragile, started to bloom in her wake, ghostly white blossoms that glowed softly in the dark. Hades saw them and said nothing, though the faintest smile crossed his lips. Perhaps he realized what she did not yet know, that even in the land of the dead, life would answer to her presence. And so, against her will, Persephone began to change. The innocence of the meadow was gone, replaced by something steadier, a strength born of loss. Though she still despised her captor, she no longer trembled before him. Her voice, once sweet as spring, now carried a calm authority that echoed through the caverns. In the shadows of eternity, Persephone, daughter of life, began to become something else entirely. The seeds of her second title had been planted. Soon, she would be known as the Queen of the Underworld. Above the earth, mortals starved. Fields lay empty, animals perished, and temples once filled with offerings grew silent. Demeter's grief had become divine vengeance. She withdrew her blessings from the world, turning it into a vast frozen tomb. Even the gods began to complain, for without mortal worship, Olympus itself grew quieter. Offerings dwindled, prayers stopped. A god without believers is like a flame without air. At last, Zeus could no longer ignore the devastation. He summoned Hermes, the swiftest and most silver-tongued of the gods. "Go below," he commanded, "and bring Persephone back. The world withers while her mother mourns." Hermes, ever dutiful, spread his winged sandals and plunged through the caverns of the earth, past rivers that remembered every sin ever committed, past judges who weighed the hearts of kings. When he entered Hades's hall, he found the Lord of the Dead sitting beside Persephone on his black throne. The contrast was startling. Death beside spring, shadow beside bloom. Hades rose, his expression guarded. Hermes bowed. "Brother," he said smoothly, "the earth above is dying. Demeter refuses to let the crops grow. Zeus commands that Persephone be returned, lest mortals and gods alike fade into hunger." Hades' gaze flickered to Persephone. She looked away. The silence stretched. A silence filled with 1,000 unspoken truths. At last, he nodded. "If it must be so," he said, "then she shall return." Persephone's heart soared, though a strange heaviness stirred within her. Hades walked her to the gates himself, his steps slow. "Before you go," he said quietly, "eat something to strengthen you for the journey." It seemed an innocent gesture. A plate of ripe red pomegranate seeds glistened before her. She hesitated, but curiosity, or perhaps kindness, overcame caution. She ate 6. Hermes, unaware of the weight of that act, led her back to the surface. As they ascended, the underworld sighed, and the first breath of spring returned to the waiting earth. But in Olympus the fates began to whisper. The rule of the dead was clear. Whoever partook of food from that realm was bound to it. Persephone had eaten 6 seeds, and so the bargain was incomplete. The goddess of spring could return, yes, but only for 6 months of every year. When Persephone's feet touched the surface again, the world gasped back to life. The ice that had strangled rivers cracked and melted. Seeds long buried sprang from the soil in a frenzy of green. Birds sang as if waking from a nightmare, and Demeter, wild-eyed, half-mad from grief, dropped her torches and ran to meet her daughter. The reunion was so fierce it shook the heavens. They clung to one another like life itself had been restored. For days, mother and daughter wandered the revived earth. Demeter filled the fields with wheat, the trees with fruit, the air with fragrance. The mortals rejoiced, feasting and singing prayers of gratitude. Even Zeus, that habitual opportunist, congratulated himself on his wise intervention. Olympus glowed again, the altars refilled, and peace seemed to settle over the world. But peace in Greek mythology never lasts long. After the celebrations faded, Hermes appeared once more. His expression carried the kind of sympathy only a messenger could afford, the kind that softens the edge of bad news without dulling its truth. He bowed before Demeter and Persephone, then spoke the words that would change the rhythm of the world forever. Persephone has eaten the food of the dead, Hermes said. 6 seeds from the pomegranate of Hades. The law is clear. Whoever tastes from that realm belongs to it in part. The silence that followed was heavier than any winter. Demeter's joy shattered. She turned to her daughter, her voice trembling between disbelief and fear. "Tell me it isn't true." Persephone, her eyes full of both guilt and wisdom, nodded slowly. "I did not know," she whispered. "He offered them as kindness." Hermes sighed. "Then there can be no full return. But Zeus, in his wisdom, decrees a compromise. For 6 months of every year, Persephone shall dwell above with her mother, and for 6 months below with her husband. Thus will the seasons turn, life and death in eternal rhythm." Demeter did not answer. She only held her daughter tighter, as if her grip could keep the months from passing. But the law of gods is iron, and so the earth itself learned to breathe, half in bloom, half in mourning. The first true spring had come, and the first winter waited just behind it. When the time came for Persephone to descend again, the earth seemed to hold its breath. Demeter wept, though she had known this moment would return. The fields began to fade beneath her tears, gold turning to grey as though the world itself mourned alongside her. The birds quieted, the winds grew still, and as the veil between the realms opened once more, Persephone walked toward it, not as a captive, but as a queen. The ground parted gently this time, no thunder, no screams, only a sigh, as if the world had accepted its rhythm. Hades awaited her in the depths, solemn and still, yet there was a flicker of something in his gaze, not triumph, but recognition. When Persephone stepped into the chariot, the darkness folded around her like a familiar cloak. In her absence, Demeter retreated once more from Olympus, her grief rippling through the seasons. Winter descended. Frost crept across the earth, rivers hardened to glass, and mortals gathered around dwindling fires. Yet this time, they did not curse the gods, for they had learned the pattern. They knew spring would come again, carried on the footsteps of Persephone's return. Below, the queen of the underworld resumed her throne beside Hades. But the underworld was no longer as it once was. Under her rule, the asphodel fields began to glow faintly, as if lit from within. The shades no longer wandered aimlessly. They found solace in her presence. Even Hades' grim halls softened, the cold stones sprouting pale, ghostly flowers. Life and death had struck a fragile balance. In her hands, Persephone now held 2 worlds, one of sun, one of shadow. When she returned above, the world bloomed. When she departed, it rested. The poets would later call it the Great Compromise, the divine order that made the seasons. But to Persephone and Demeter, it was never so poetic. For them, it remained what it had always been, a parting, a reunion, and a waiting in between. Each ascent brought joy, each descent sorrow, yet both were necessary, for without the dying, there could be no rebirth. And so, the wheel of the year began to turn endlessly, guided by a mother's love and a daughter's destiny. With each descent, Persephone grew stronger. The timid maiden who once gathered flowers beneath the sun had transformed into something altogether different. regal, measured, and calm amid the endless murmur of the dead. She no longer flinched at the cries of lost souls or the chill that hung in the caverns. Where others saw despair, she began to see order. Where others saw ruin, she saw purpose. Hades, for his part, had changed as well. He no longer viewed her as a stolen prize, but as an equal, one who could stand beside him without fear. Together they ruled in an uneasy harmony, he as the stern arbiter of fate, she as the quiet mercy that softened it. When spirits entered his halls, it was Persephone who listened to their final regrets. Her presence brought warmth even to the dead, and word of her compassion reached the living. Mortals began to whisper her name not with dread, but with reverence. Still, she could not entirely banish her sorrow. In the stillness of her throne, she often imagined her mother's laughter, the hum of bees, the scent of rain on wheat. Yet there was no bitterness now, only the understanding that her fate was not a punishment, but a balance. She had become both seed and soil, bloom and decay. The goddess of spring had learned to live among ghosts. Hades would sometimes find her wandering the meadows of asphodel, fingers trailing through the spectral grass. "You have brought life to death," he once told her. "Even the darkness bends toward you." She smiled faintly. "Then perhaps the darkness was never as cruel as we thought," she said. Above them, Demeter endured the cold months in patience rather than fury, knowing that her daughter would return. Each year, their reunion became the heartbeat of the world, joy and grief alternating like breath. The mortals came to see Persephone not merely as the bride of Hades, but as the bridge between worlds. When they buried their dead, they prayed to her for gentleness in passing. When they sowed their fields, they prayed for her return. Thus Persephone's shadow fell across both realms, half sunlight, half night, the goddess who taught gods and mortals alike that even death must yield for a time to life. By the time mortals learned to name the seasons, Persephone had become a figure of paradox, a goddess whose life was both captivity and coronation, tragedy and triumph. From her time below, she had learned patience and empathy. From her time above, renewal and joy. Between the two worlds, she saw what few gods ever understood, that life and death were not enemies, but dance partners, trading steps in an endless waltz. In the underworld, she brought order where there had been despair. The lost souls who once drifted in gloom now found comfort in her calm gaze. Some claimed that flowers of light sprouted wherever she walked, fragile white blooms that fed on memory instead of sun. Even the judges of the dead, severe and unsmiling, began to soften their tone when she entered the chamber. It was as though her presence reminded them that mercy too was divine. Above, Demeter watched her daughter's yearly return with both joy and restraint. The world burst into life at the sight of Persephone, but Demeter had learned not to clutch her too tightly. The goddess of harvest, who had once wielded famine as a weapon, now understood something deeper, that love cannot cage what must move between worlds. Mortals built temples to both mother and daughter, one for the plenty of spring, one for the promise of rest. They offered grain to Demeter and pomegranate to Persephone, honouring both the bloom and the burial. The Eleusinian mysteries were born from this sacred rhythm, an initiation that whispered of rebirth, of hope beyond death. Zeus, ever pragmatic, pretended the arrangement had been his wisdom all along. Yet even he could not deny that what began as a theft had become a balance, one that sustained the earth itself. For Persephone, her dual existence no longer felt like division, but destiny. She had become the hinge of creation, the boundary between joy and sorrow, harvest and hunger, birth and grave. And though her heart ached when she left her mother each autumn, she carried that ache like a crown. For she knew what few gods dared to admit. Every paradise needs its shadow, and every ending hides the seed of a beginning. Ages passed, empires rose and fell, but the story of Persephone and Hades endured. Whispered by priests, carved in stone, and sung by poets who saw in her tale the rhythm of all existence. Each spring she returned to the sunlit world, her arrival heralded by the unfurling of petals and the laughter of rivers. Each autumn she descended again, and the world bowed in quiet reverence, surrendering to sleep. Thus the wheel of time kept turning, guided by her footsteps, half in bloom, half in shadow. In the underworld, Persephone no longer mourned. She ruled beside Hades with poise born of sorrow and wisdom. Her throne, once a symbol of captivity, became one of balance, the meeting place of life and death, joy and despair. Mortals imagined her as cold, but in truth she was serenity itself. She understood what the living feared to learn, that endings are merely transformations, and every descent is followed by a return. Demeter too changed with the ages. The mother who once brought famine in her grief now blessed the harvest with a steady, tempered hand. She no longer raged at the cycle, but embraced it, knowing her daughter's absence was what gave meaning to her return. Between mother and daughter, a pact was sealed, not one of words, but of understanding. Even Hades, the eternal judge, found renewal in her presence. The god once shunned by both mortals and Olympians now ruled a realm no longer defined by terror, but by inevitability. With Persephone at his side, death became not an end, but a passage, and so the myth became the mirror of the world itself. Spring's joy, summer's abundance, autumn's decay, winter's sleep, all reflections of Persephone's journey. To the ancients, she was not just a goddess, but a law of nature, proof that creation and destruction were two halves of the same truth. When poets spoke her name, they did so with both awe and sorrow. She was the daughter of life and the bride of death, the eternal mediator who taught even gods that nothing truly ends. For as long as flowers bloom after snow, as long as love survives loss, Persephone walks between worlds, and the seasons follow her. In the glittering courts of Olympus, perfection was the only acceptable currency. Every god shimmered with beauty, power, and symmetry, each one sculpted like a living flame. Hera, queen of the heavens, had always prided herself on her divine form and lineage. But when the time came for her to bear a child, the outcome was not what she expected. The infant that emerged from her womb was unlike any god ever born. His legs were twisted, his cry harsh and uneven, and his skin lacked the golden glow of Olympus. Hephaestus was, by all divine standards, imperfect. Hera looked upon him and saw not a son, but a humiliation, proof that even a goddess could produce something flawed. Zeus, distracted by his endless affairs and thunderbolts, paid no mind. The child's deformity became a stain on her vanity, a whisper among the gods that Hera had lost her divine favour. And so, in a fit of rage disguised as righteousness, she did the unthinkable. The queen of Olympus lifted her newborn by his small ankle and hurled him from the heights of heaven. His cries echoed through the sky for a full day and night as he plummeted toward the mortal world. No lightning struck to save him, no divine hand reached out in mercy. The godling struck the sea with a sound that silenced even the waves. But fate, as always, had other plans. Thetis, the sea nymph destined to one day birth Achilles, found the broken child entangled in seaweed. Beside her, the Oceanid Eurynome gazed at the infant and felt a pang of pity that not even the gods above seemed capable of. Together, they carried him into the deep, to a grotto of coral and pearls, hidden from Olympus's judgment. There, in the cool blue silence, Hephaestus was tended to with care. His legs healed crooked, but his spirit hardened like metal in fire. He would grow up far from Olympus, far from beauty and vanity, in a world where survival depended on skill, not charm. The gods above had thrown away a crippled child. What they did not know was that they had cast away the one who would forge the very weapons that made them gods. Far below the thrones of Olympus, the sea rocked the discarded god like a cradle. In the shimmering depths, Thetis and Eurynome became his guardians, teaching him not the arrogance of gods, but the patience of tides. While Olympus thrived on lightning and vanity, the sea was silent, enduring, and ancient. Here, Hephaestus learned that what breaks can also be reforged. He grew among coral pillars and swaying kelp, a child of exile surrounded by the hum of currents and the songs of whales. His legs, once broken, healed crooked, but his hands were miraculous. They learned to shape, to build, to repair. With coral hammers and volcanic stones, he began crafting tools from the wreckage that drifted down from the mortal world. Bronze fish, pearl cups, chains of silver that shimmered like moonlight, he made beauty from ruin. The sea nymphs marvelled at his skill. They brought him scraps from shipwrecks, gold coins, iron nails, bits of armour swallowed by the waves. To most, they were junk. To Hephaestus, they were possibilities. He melted and moulded them in his underwater forge, powered by volcanic vents that burned with the earth's secret fire. It was there, in exile, that he became the first craftsman, not by divine birthright, but by necessity. Yet, even beneath the waves, whispers of Olympus reached him. Tales of gleaming gods and their perfect forms stung him like salt in an open wound. Hephaestus did not envy their beauty. He despised it. He saw in it the cold cruelty that had cast him away. Each strike of his hammer became an act of defiance, a rhythm that said, "I exist, and I create." Thetis watched him in silence, sometimes catching a flicker of divine fire in his eyes, a spark not born from wrath, but from purpose. Eurynome, the wiser of the two, once told him, "The gods above may live in light, child, but only those who have seen darkness know how to make it shine." Hephaestus did not yet know his destiny. He only knew the forge, the flame, and the sound of the sea echoing through his cave. But soon his creations would rise to Olympus, and the gods who cast him out would have no choice but to remember his name. As years passed beneath the sea, the crippled child became a god of cunning craft. Hephaestus discovered something extraordinary, a secret that would change both heaven and earth. Deep within his volcanic forge, he coaxed raw fire into obedience. It was not the wild flame of Zeus's lightning, but a quieter, steadier kind, the fire of creation, not destruction. Where the Olympians wielded force, Hephaestus shaped it. The sea nymphs watched in awe as sparks danced from his anvil, illuminating the dark waters like falling stars. Coral walls glowed red and gold. The cave pulsed with life. From molten metal, he forged delicate wonders, a brooch that shimmered with trapped sunlight, a chariot of bronze that could glide across water, and chains so fine they seemed spun from light itself. Thetis whispered that his forge had become a rival to Olympus itself, but Hephaestus was no longer content with secrecy. His art demanded recognition. He began crafting a gift, not for himself, but for the mother who had cast him away. From iron and gold, he forged a throne fit for a queen. It gleamed with impossible beauty, each detail shaped with patient fury. Yet beneath its beauty, he wove a mechanism, invisible to the eye, inevitable in its consequence. The throne was a masterpiece, but also a trap. When the gift was finished, he sent it up to Olympus by way of a shimmering current, carried by dolphins and guided by divine rumour. Hera, upon receiving it, could not resist. It was exquisite beyond words, a work of perfection born from imperfection. With a smile of triumph, she seated herself upon it. And instantly, she was caught. The golden throne clamped around her like a living cage, invisible chains binding her arms and feet. The queen of the heavens, proud, flawless, and cruel, found herself imprisoned by the son she had once thrown away. The gods rushed to free her, but none could undo the craftsmanship of Hephaestus. Every tool snapped, every spell failed. Hera's screams echoed through Olympus, and for the first time, the gods trembled not before Zeus's thunder, But before the forge of the forgotten god who burned below the sea, Olympus descended into chaos. The queen of the heavens was trapped, and her cries of rage rattled the marble halls. Hera's golden throne, that shining gift, had become her prison. None of the gods could break the spell. Ares tried brute strength, splitting the columns of the throne room. Apollo summoned light to melt the chains. Hermes whispered every charm he knew. All failed. The craftsmanship was too intricate, the mechanism too clever. The gods, for all their power, were outwitted by the very creature they had deemed unworthy. Zeus's fury was boundless. He sent storm after storm across the earth, demanding the return of his wife's freedom. But no one knew where the smith god dwelled. Only Thetis and Eurynome knew the truth, that he was hidden beneath the waves, forging with calm precision while Olympus panicked above. When word finally reached him, Hephaestus laughed, a slow, bitter sound that rolled like thunder through the sea. He had not sought blood, only acknowledgement. His throne had been a message written in gold. I am your equal, not your embarrassment. Yet now, even the great Zeus knelt before the consequences of his wife's cruelty. Desperation grew. One by one, the gods volunteered to descend and plead with Hephaestus to release Hera, but none returned successful. They tried bribery, threats, even pity. Hephaestus, hammer in hand, ignored them all. He had waited too long to be seen. He would not trade his vengeance for empty apologies. Finally, the gods turned to Dionysus, the god of wine, for if strength and reason failed, perhaps intoxication would not. Dionysus descended to Hephaestus's cave, carrying a cup of divine nectar. He found the smith hard at work, sparks leaping like stars around him. The god of revelry poured him a drink, then another, and another still. Hephaestus, unaccustomed to wine, loosened his tongue, and his heart. Dionysus did not beg or bargain. He simply listened. He laughed at the right moments, cursed Olympus at the others, and in that shared contempt, a strange friendship was born. By dawn, Hephaestus, drunk but smiling, agreed to return with him. Not as a prisoner, but as an artist whose work the gods could no longer ignore. Olympus had never known humiliation like this. Hera, the queen of the gods, trapped on her own throne by an invisible snare, cursed and screamed as the other deities circled helplessly. Apollo's songs did nothing. Ares broke 3 golden hammers in rage. Not even Zeus, lord of the sky, could pry her free. The throne was flawless, a divine lock built by a divine grudge. Desperate, the gods convened in panic. They needed Hephaestus, the son they had never claimed, the crippled exile who now held their queen hostage with craftsmanship alone. But summoning him was no simple task. He would not answer Olympus. He had no reason to. The gods had forgotten him, and he preferred it that way. It was Dionysus, god of wine and revelry, who proposed a solution. "If he won't return to Olympus," he said with a smirk, "then we'll bring Olympus to him, in a bottle." While the others sharpened swords and prepared bribes, Dionysus took a different route, a wineskin and a charming grin. He descended into the mortal world and found Hephaestus in his volcanic forge, his hands stained with soot, his face unreadable. Dionysus offered him wine, then more wine, then just enough flattery to pass as conversation. The 2 gods drank, laughed, and shared tales of godly dysfunction. Somewhere between the 4th toast and the 6th insult toward Zeus's beard, Hephaestus began to laugh. Not bitterly, genuinely. And that was all Dionysus needed. With the god of the forge now swaying slightly, Dionysus slung him over a donkey and paraded him up to Olympus, in what must have been the most undignified return in divine history. A drunk, limping god, slumped sideways on a braying mule, surrounded by satyrs playing flutes. The Olympians watched the spectacle in stunned silence. Hephaestus dismounted, not with grace, but with defiance. He looked Hera in the eyes, no longer a child begging for acceptance, but a god returning on his own terms. Only then did he release her from the golden throne. not with malice, but with measured control. In that moment, Hephaestus wasn't just forgiven, he was feared. Olympus would never laugh at the cripple again. They would bow to the god who could build prisons from beauty. From that day onward, Olympus treated Hephaestus differently. The same gods who once turned away from his twisted legs now marvelled at the precision of his hands. Zeus himself, swallowing his pride, granted Hephaestus his own divine workshop, a forge that burned inside the heart of Mount Olympus, its bellows powered by sacred winds. From there, the crippled god reshaped the heavens. His anvil rang day and night. With every strike, sparks flew across the sky like shooting stars. He forged crowns for queens, armour for heroes, and weapons that could shake the world. For Zeus, he created the thunderbolt, lightning chained in metal, an impossible feat. For Poseidon, he built the trident, which could split the seas with a gesture. Even Hermes owed him his winged sandals, delicate as smoke, yet swifter than any wind. But Hephaestus didn't craft merely for power, he crafted for perfection. His creations weren't just tools, they were art, each infused with the same quiet defiance that had fueled his survival. To him, beauty was not born of symmetry, but of purpose. Every flaw was a story, every scar a signature. And while the gods admired his genius, few understood the cost. His forge was both temple and prison. The endless fire demanded everything from him, his time, his breath, his peace. When mortals dreamed of gods, they imagined feasts and gold halls. Hephaestus dreamed of silence, of the hiss of metal cooling in water. Even so, the forge gave him dignity. For the first time, he belonged, not because Olympus had forgiven him, but because they needed him. The god they once cast into the sea now held the fate of the gods in his hands. Still, whispers trailed him like smoke. Some said he worked too hard, others that he still nursed old grudges. Hephaestus ignored them all. When the flames of his forge reflected in his eyes, even Ares hesitated to speak. He had become the divine blacksmith, builder of Olympus, architect of divine war, and the quiet craftsman behind every god's power. From rejection, he had forged dominion. From imperfection, he had shaped immortality. And the fire that once exiled him now bowed to his will. For all his triumph in the forge, Hephaestus still lacked what every Olympian was expected to possess: companionship. The gods of Olympus were rarely single, though their marriages were usually as stable as Dionysus after a wine festival. Zeus, ever the meddler, decided that the god of fire deserved a bride, and so, in an act that might have been mercy or mischief, he offered Hephaestus the hand of Aphrodite, goddess of love and the most beautiful being in existence. The announcement stunned Olympus. The gods whispered, the goddesses snickered. Aphrodite herself was not consulted. She, the embodiment of desire, bound to the crippled smith. It was unthinkable. Yet the will of Zeus was law. The wedding was held in golden splendour, with ambrosia flowing and laughter echoing through marble halls. Hephaestus stood beside his bride, like a mountain beside a flame, sturdy, silent, and already aware that beauty was rarely kind. Aphrodite tolerated her husband, but never loved him. She visited his forge only when she wanted jewellery, golden girdles, delicate chains, ornaments so fine they made even Hera jealous. But while Hephaestus toiled in the heat of creation, Aphrodite found warmth elsewhere, in the arms of Ares, god of war. Their affair was an open secret, whispered across Olympus like smoke from a smouldering fire, yet Hephaestus was no fool. He noticed the missing glances, the laughter behind closed doors, the faint scent of iron and perfume that lingered after midnight. And though the other gods pitied him, they underestimated him. For if there was one thing Hephaestus understood, it was how to set a trap. With quiet precision, he forged an invisible net of gold, fine as spider silk, unbreakable as fate. He waited until the lovers met again, then let the net fall. The chains shimmered into being, binding Ares and Aphrodite together mid-embrace. At dawn he summoned the gods to witness his vengeance. The laughter that followed was thunderous. The lovers were shamed before all of Olympus. Their beauty and power turned into spectacle. Hephaestus did not smile. He simply watched, his face unreadable, his victory as cold and deliberate as forged bronze. The gods laughed at Ares that day, but none laughed at Hephaestus ever again. The laughter of Olympus echoed for days after Hephaestus revealed his golden trap. The gods found endless amusement in the sight of Ares and Aphrodite, two paragons of passion, caught like clumsy mortals in a web of divine craftsmanship. Even Apollo, usually composed, laughed until tears streamed down his face. But beneath the noise, Hephaestus stood apart, calm, almost detached. His revenge was not born of fury. It was an artist's signature carved into humiliation. Zeus eventually intervened, his thunderous voice restoring a semblance of order. "Enough," he declared, though even he could not hide his smirk. "Release them, Smith of Olympus. You've proven your craft." And so, with a slow and deliberate motion, Hephaestus touched the anvil and dissolved the golden net. The lovers fled in silence. Their pride melted like wax before flame. Ares never forgave him. The god of war nursed the grudge like a festering wound, swearing vengeance. But Hephaestus was unbothered. He had long learned that pain was a poor excuse to stop creating. His forge roared louder than ever, not from anger, but from purpose. In the days that followed, he worked like a man possessed. He forged automatons, gleaming statues of gold and bronze that moved on their own, powered by divine fire. They guarded his workshop, served his every need, and spoke in metallic voices. Mortals would later call them the first machines, but to Hephaestus they were companions, beings that could not betray, laugh, or cheat. Even Hera, who once cast him from the heavens, now came to him for favours. She wanted new adornments, new symbols of her majesty. He crafted them without complaint, though his eyes held a quiet irony she chose to ignore. When mortals prayed to the gods, they asked for victory, love, or wisdom. But when they prayed to Hephaestus, they asked for skill, for steady hands, for patience, for mastery of craft. He gave them all these freely. Hephaestus had been mocked, rejected, and betrayed, but his vengeance was elegant. Every god, every hero, every kingdom would depend on his creations. The crippled child of Olympus had turned his suffering into immortality. His fire no longer burned for wrath. It burned to remind the heavens who had forged their glory. Though his forge stood among the clouds, Hephaestus found little joy in the company of gods. They came to him for favours, not friendship. Their praise was hollow, their laughter fleeting. But one day, a mortal hero came knocking, a man of earth and bone, who would treat the smith not as a tool, but as an equal. His name was Achilles. Thetis, the same sea goddess who had once rescued the abandoned infant, now came to her foster son once more, but this time to ask for armour for her mortal child. She found Hephaestus as she had centuries before, soot-stained and focused, his hammer singing against the anvil. When she spoke of her son's valour, of the war raging at Troy, the old god paused. Thetis had saved him from oblivion. This debt he could not ignore. He rose from his bench and promised her a gift worthy of legend. For 9 days and nights the forge blazed brighter than any star. The gods themselves leaned from their thrones to watch the sparks dance above Olympus. When the work was done, Hephaestus presented the armour, a masterpiece of divine craftsmanship. The breastplate shone like sunrise. The shield told the story of the world, oceans, constellations, cities, beasts, and men, all etched in living metal. When Achilles wore it, even the immortal eyes of the gods blinked in awe. The armour did more than protect him. It made him myth. Mortals sang that his brilliance on the battlefield was the reflection of the gods' fire itself. And though Achilles would one day fall, his glory would not. The shield outlived the man. It became proof that the creations of Hephaestus could outlast even death. For perhaps the first time, the god of forges saw in a mortal what he had long sought in gods: gratitude. Achilles had worn his work not with arrogance, but with pride. In that mortal warrior, Hephaestus saw reflection, beauty born from imperfection, greatness forged through pain. When Thetis thanked him, Hephaestus only nodded and said, "Fire burns what it touches, but it also makes the clay strong." And with that, he returned to his forge, his hammer once again singing to the rhythm of destiny. Hephaestus was not merely a blacksmith. He was a creator, a divine engineer centuries ahead of his time. His mind never rested, always seeking new forms of life that could obey the laws of precision rather than the whims of gods. From his forge in Olympus, he began crafting beings not of flesh, but of metal, golden automatons, shining constructs animated by divine intelligence. They were neither mortal nor divine, yet something in between. He made them in pairs, giving each the shape of a flawless maiden, their joints smooth and gleaming like liquid sunlight. They could walk, speak, and even think, their eyes glowing softly with firelight. They tended his forge, brought him tools, and sang in mechanical harmony as the hammers fell. In their perfect obedience, Hephaestus found a peace that Olympus never offered. Among his creations was Talos, a bronze giant forged to guard the island of Crete. Massive and relentless, Talos circled the island 3 times each day, protecting it from invaders. His single vein ran with molten ichor, the blood of gods, sealed with a nail hammered by Hephaestus himself. Talos was not just a guardian, he was a statement. The god who had been thrown away had now built a being that could defend empires. The Olympians watched these inventions with unease. Zeus admired the efficiency, but others whispered that Hephaestus had gone too far, that he was meddling in the work of creation reserved for the fates. Even Athena, goddess of wisdom, regarded his automatons with cautious curiosity. But Hephaestus did not care. The gods created chaos. He created order. Yet, behind every invention lay a shadow of loneliness. His golden servants could mimic affection, but they could not feel it. They obeyed his voice, but not his heart. When they spoke, their words were flawless and hollow. The perfection he forged only deepened his isolation. Sometimes, as the fire dimmed, Hephaestus would watch them move and wonder if he had become like them. A machine made for endless labour, built from rejection and duty. But when he struck his anvil again, the thought vanished. For a god born unwanted, creation was the only form of love that never left him. Of all the works born from Hephaestus's forge, none carried such weight or irony as the chains of Prometheus. For once again, the god of creation was ordered to craft instruments of punishment. The command came from Zeus himself, furious that Prometheus had stolen fire from Olympus and gifted it to humankind. Fire, Hephaestus's own sacred element, had been given away without permission. To Zeus, it was betrayal. To Hephaestus, it was complicated. He knew what it meant to be punished for giving light to the undeserving. But defying Zeus was not an option. The king of gods summoned him, his voice sharp as thunder. "Forge unbreakable chains," he ordered, "for the Titan who dared challenge heaven." And so Hephaestus obeyed, though his hammer fell heavier that day, the sparks dimmer, the air thicker. He forged the chains from adamantine, the hardest metal known to gods. Each link was seamless, each bond unyielding. When the work was done, he climbed to the Caucasus Mountains, where the winds howled like the cries of the condemned. There, Prometheus awaited him, proud, unflinching, unrepentant. "Do it," said the Titan, meeting Hephaestus's gaze. "You understand why I did it?" Hephaestus said nothing. He only raised his hammer. Every strike echoed through eternity, not as cruelty, but as sorrow. When the final shackle locked, Prometheus was bound to the cliffside, condemned to have his liver devoured daily by Zeus's eagle. only for it to grow back again. "Forgive me," Hephaestus murmured. "The hand that binds you is not the heart that condemns." Prometheus smiled faintly through the pain. "Then keep forging, smith. Every fire burns because of men like us." Hephaestus turned away, the words searing deeper than any flame. For he understood the truth. Fire was rebellion, creation was defiance, and punishment was often the price of both. When he returned to Olympus, Zeus praised the chains, declaring them perfect. Hephaestus only nodded. Perfection, he knew, was often another word for cruelty. And though his hands had made the prison, his heart remained with the captive Titan, the one being who had dared, as he once did, to bring light to those living in the dark. Long before the wrath of Achilles shook the walls of Troy, there was a love story that began not with romance, but with prophecy. It was the tale of Thetis, the immortal sea goddess whose beauty made even the stars blush, and Peleus, the mortal hero fated to love her. Their meeting was not born of chance, nor of choice. It was decreed by fear, the fear of the gods themselves. You see, Thetis was no ordinary nymph. She was one of the Nereids, daughters of the old man of the sea, graceful and powerful in equal measure. Her hair shone like sunlight on the waves. Her voice carried through the tides, and both Zeus and Poseidon, mighty rulers of heaven and sea, desired her. But when the goddess of prophecy, Themis, revealed the truth, that Thetis would bear a son greater than his father, the two most powerful gods in existence recoiled. They, who feared nothing, now feared their own downfall. So they made a decision. Thetis would not wed a god. She would be given instead to a mortal, a man whose life would end long before hers, ensuring the child of their union could never rival Olympus. And so their eyes turned to Peleus, a noble king from the mortal world, son of Aeacus and descendant of Zeus himself, a man brave, disciplined, and honourable, yet still tragically human. Peleus was told by the wise centaur Chiron that his fate was entwined with that of the sea goddess. "You will win her," Chiron warned, "but only through courage and patience. She will resist, as wild as the waves that bore her." And so, the mortal man set out to find the goddess of the sea, not to conquer her, but to fulfill what the fates had already written. On a lonely shore where foam met sand, he caught sight of her for the first time. Thetis rose from the waves, her form gleaming like liquid moonlight, eyes as cold as the deep. She looked upon Peleus and saw her future, the one she did not want. And though she did not yet know it, from that reluctant union would one day be born a child whose name would echo through eternity. Achilles, the greatest of all mortal warriors. Winning the heart of a goddess was never going to be easy, especially one who had no desire for mortal love. Thetis was the ocean made flesh, untamed, ever-shifting, and proud. Peleus, though a king among men, was to her nothing more than a fleeting ripple on the surface of time. Yet prophecy bound them together, and the will of Zeus left her with no escape. Still, Thetis swore she would never yield to a mortal's touch. Peleus, for his part, was not a man of gentle words. He was a warrior, trained in endurance, not poetry. When he sought the advice of Chiron, the wise centaur told him plainly, "You cannot win her through beauty or power. You must hold her until she cannot flee. When the sea finds no shore to crash against, it surrenders." The advice sounded impossible, and yet Peleus trusted the wisdom of his old teacher. One dawn, he climbed to the shore where Thetis often rested, her feet in the foam and her gaze lost in the horizon. As she rose from the waves, the light of morning glimmered across her skin like liquid gold. Before she could retreat, Peleus seized her by the wrists. She cried out, her eyes flashing like lightning beneath the sea. At once her body changed. She became water, slipping through his fingers. Yet he caught her again. She became fire, burning his flesh. Still, he did not release her. She turned to a lion, roaring in fury, then a serpent coiling around his arm, then a hawk shrieking into the sky. But Peleus held firm, every muscle straining, refusing to surrender. His will was iron, his purpose divine. At last, exhausted and defeated, Thetis returned to her true form, a woman of immortal grace, trembling with fury and awe. "You are either brave," she said, "or a fool." "Perhaps both," Peleus answered, his grip loosening. In that moment, something shifted. The sea, for all its pride, had met a rock it could not break. Thetis, though unwilling, recognized strength and fate. She would be his, not by choice, but by destiny's decree. The mortal had conquered the divine, and the waves themselves seemed to bow in silence. The union of Peleus and Thetis was unlike any the world had seen, a wedding arranged by the gods themselves, yet born from resistance rather than love. When Zeus decreed that the sea goddess would marry the mortal king of Phthia, Olympus erupted into celebration. After all, divine weddings were rare, and this one promised to bridge heaven, earth, and sea. The gods sent invitations across the realms, calling nymphs, muses, and immortals to witness it. Mount Pelion was chosen for the ceremony, the same mountain where the wise centaur Chiron had tutored heroes. Its slopes were adorned with flowers that bloomed overnight, and streams ran with nectar instead of water. The air shimmered with divine music. Thetis, radiant yet solemn, wore a gown spun from sea foam, her hair crowned with pearls that glowed like starlight. Beside her stood Peleus, mortal yet regal, clad in armour forged by Hephaestus himself, a gift from the gods to honour their chosen man. But beneath the splendour, tension stirred. Thetis's eyes never met Peleus's. Her smile was polite, her silence heavy. She was a goddess forced into a mortal fate, and though she would fulfill it with grace, her heart remained bound to the sea. The guests, sensing the unease, pretended not to see. For on Olympus, even discomfort must look divine. Every god and goddess attended, save one. Eris, goddess of strife, had not been invited. Her presence, Zeus declared, would spoil the harmony of the event. But no god is easily dismissed, and Eris would not forgive the slight. As the feast reached its height, she appeared in a flash of gold and tossed a single apple into the crowd. Upon it was inscribed 3 simple words: "To the fairest." That small act shattered the illusion of peace. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite each reached for the apple, and with that gesture, the seeds of the Trojan War were sown. Yet for now, the laughter continued, and Peleus and Thetis exchanged vows before gods and men. Their marriage was sealed with wine and sea foam, the joining of fire and water, of mortality and immortality. And though neither knew it yet, their child would bear the fury of both. A hero destined to make the world remember his name, Achilles. Even before Achilles drew his first breath, whispers of his destiny echoed across both sea and sky. The fates themselves, those ancient weavers of inevitability, spoke on the night of the wedding. As the gods feasted on Mount Pelion, their voices trembled through the smoke of the sacrificial fires. "A son shall be born of this union," they proclaimed, "greater than his father, swifter than any hero, yet doomed to live a short and glorious life." The words silenced Olympus. Even the laughter of Dionysus died in his throat. Hera frowned, Poseidon turned away, and Zeus, ever wary of prophecies, stared into his cup. The warning was familiar, a cruel echo of the reason Thetis had been forced to wed a mortal in the first place, and now it returned to haunt them. Thetis too heard the prophecy and shuddered. She had accepted her fate, but she would not accept doom for her child. "My son will not die young," she swore to herself. "If the gods would curse him, then I will make him immortal." But even she, a daughter of the sea, knew the limits of divine interference. Immortality could not be freely granted. It demanded a price, and often a wound. Meanwhile, Peleus heard only the first part of the prophecy, greater than his father. To a mortal king, this was not a curse, but a promise. He dreamed of a son who would surpass him, a warrior unmatched, a legend born of his line. Pride, not fear, filled his heart. In the quiet nights that followed, Thetis would rise from their marriage bed and stand by the shore, her feet touching the foam, her eyes searching the horizon. She could feel the pull of the sea calling her back, whispering that mortals were fragile things, and that no child born of both worlds could belong entirely to either. Still, the prophecy was set. The child of fire and water, of flesh and divinity, would soon be born. Thetis prayed the fates might forget their own words, but the fates never forget. Somewhere in the stillness of the night, destiny smiled. Achilles was coming, and with him glory and grief in equal measure. When the time of birth arrived, thunder rolled across the mountains, and the sea itself rose to meet the shore. The union of mortal and divine had created something new, something the world was not prepared for. Thetis cried out, her voice echoing between land and ocean, and in that moment the gods turned their gaze toward Phthia. Even Zeus paused his thunderbolts to listen. Chiron the centaur, wise as always, was summoned to assist. He came down from Mount Pelion, carrying herbs, charms, and the calm of eternity. He knew that this child would be no ordinary infant. "The world changes with his breath," he whispered, as he laid his hands upon the newborn. And there he was, Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, glowing faintly with divine light, his first cry fierce and clear as a war horn. Peleus looked upon his son with pride, untainted by fear. To him, this child was the promise of immortality through legacy. "He will be the greatest of men," he said. But Thetis, holding her child close, saw something else, a shadow in his brightness, a whisper of the prophecy she could not silence. The infant's skin shone like polished ivory, yet beneath his perfection Thetis could feel mortality pulsing, fragile, fleeting. She knew that in him the blood of gods and men fought silently. She feared what that struggle would bring. That night, when Peleus slept, Thetis carried her child to the sea. The waves parted for her, recognizing their mistress. There she bathed Achilles in the sacred waters, hoping to wash away his mortality. But the sea could not take what fate had bound. Immortality, once denied to her, would not be freely given to her son. Still, Thetis refused to accept defeat. If the sea could not protect him, perhaps fire could. There existed an ancient secret among the gods. That divine flame could burn away mortality if one dared to endure the pain. And so, she made her decision in silence. By dawn, the child slept peacefully in her arms, but Thetis's eyes were stormy. Achilles was alive, yet unprotected. She knew the time would come when she must try again, to outwit destiny itself, even if it meant defying Olympus once more. Thetis could not sleep. The prophecy haunted her with every breath her child took. Achilles was radiant, divine blood glowing beneath mortal skin, yet she could see how fragile he truly was. Each time he cried, she felt the echo of death. So, one night, she rose from Peleus's side, cradled her infant son, and went to the great hearth of their palace. If the gods would not grant her son immortality, she would seize it herself. There was an ancient belief whispered among the sea nymphs that fire, sacred and eternal, could burn away mortality if wielded by divine hands. So Thetis, desperate and defiant, held her son over the flames. She did not throw him in. She let the fire lick his limbs, consuming the mortal weakness in his flesh, while her divine touch protected him from pain. The flames hissed and curled around him, a strange fusion of agony and blessing. Each night she returned to the hearth, dipping Achilles into the sacred fire. Slowly, his skin grew stronger, shining faintly like polished bronze. But immortality demands balance, and her secret ritual did not go unnoticed. One evening, Peleus awoke and found his wife standing over the fire, his son half submerged in the glow. He shouted in horror, mistaking devotion for madness. Thetis turned, her eyes wide with divine fury. "You fool!" she cried. "I was burning away his death, but the moment was lost." Peleus rushed forward, wrenching the child from her hands. The flames sputtered, and the spell broke. The fire dimmed, leaving behind only smoke and silence. Thetis stared at her mortal husband, the man who had interrupted the impossible, and realized their worlds could never truly meet. Without another word, she vanished into the sea, leaving behind only salt on the air and sorrow in Peleus's heart. The child, unharmed but unfinished, slept in his father's arms, strong yet not immortal. And so the attempt failed, but not completely. The fire had strengthened Achilles in ways even the gods could not fully measure. His body would one day resist every wound but one, a single weakness that no flame could erase. Destiny had claimed its share, and the sea goddess had lost her fight against fate. Thetis may have fled to the sea, but her resolve did not die with her failed ritual. Maternal love, even in a goddess, does not surrender easily. She had sworn to protect her son from death, and if fire could not burn away mortality, perhaps the underworld's waters could. For in the depths of the earth flowed the river Styx, a boundary so sacred that even the gods swore oaths upon it, knowing a broken vow there would bring ruin. Its waters were not of life, but of eternity. So one moonless night, Thetis returned. Her beauty was dimmed by sorrow, her eyes fixed on her sleeping child. She lifted Achilles gently, wrapped him in sea silk, and vanished again into the dark. Through shadowed caves and ancient fissures, she descended to the underworld, where even Hermes hesitated to tread. The Styx lay before her, black, silent, and gleaming like obsidian. Around it drifted the whispers of forgotten souls. Thetis hesitated only once. Then, whispering a mother's prayer, she dipped her son into the water. The river hissed, reacting to divine flesh. Its current curled around Achilles, coating him with its deadly blessing. But as fate would have it, her hand trembled. She held him by the heel, the one spot untouched by the river's power. When she lifted him from the Styx, his skin shone with an otherworldly glow, hardened and invincible, but that small heel remained pale and unguarded. The child stirred, unknowing, invulnerable, almost. Thetis kissed his forehead, both triumphant and afraid. She had succeeded where few dared to try. Her son would be nearly immortal, yet the small oversight, that single vulnerable point, would one day prove fatal. The gods, amused by her defiance, let her go, for even they respected the cruelty of fate. When she returned to the world above, the waves rose to greet her, shimmering with pride. Achilles was safe, or so she believed. She laid him once more beside Peleus, and vanished into the sea for good, leaving the mortal world behind. The boy slept peacefully, untouched by fire, shielded by death's own river. But in the stillness of that night, the fates smiled. 3 silent weavers, who knew that even near immortality was still no match for destiny. After Thetis vanished into the sea, Peleus was left with a child half divine and half mortal, radiant, untouchable, and utterly beyond his understanding. Though he loved his son fiercely, he knew that Achilles was not meant for an ordinary childhood. His strength, even as an infant, was astonishing. He could wrestle serpents in his crib, and the nursemaids whispered that his eyes gleamed like a predator's even in sleep. Peleus, wise enough to fear what he adored, turned to the one being who could guide such a child, the immortal centaur, Chiron. Chiron lived high on Mount Pelion, a place where mortal and divine worlds met. Unlike other centaurs, who were wild and savage, Chiron was noble, patient, and impossibly wise. He had tutored heroes before, Jason, Theseus, and even Heracles. But when Peleus arrived, carrying the infant Achilles, Chiron sensed something different. "This one," he said softly, "will not live long." but his name will outlive kingdoms, and so began Achilles' true education. Under Chiron's care, the boy learned more than the art of war. The centaur taught him music, poetry, medicine, and mercy. He learned the ways of herbs and stars, how to track a deer through mist, and how to mend a wounded heart. Yet above all, he learned discipline, the balance between rage and reason, strength and restraint. Each morning, Chiron tested him with the bow, the spear, and the sword. By noon, he hunted on the slopes of Pelion, running faster than any hound. At dusk, he listened to the old centaur's stories, of gods and men, of pride and downfall. "Remember, Achilles," Chiron would say, "glory is a flame. It can light the world or burn it down." But even as Achilles grew in skill and wisdom, there was restlessness in his blood. He felt the sea calling to him, though he did not understand why. At night he dreamed of a woman's voice, soft and sorrowful, whispering his name beneath the waves. Chiron said nothing of it. He knew better than to fight fate. The boy's path was already written, forged by gods, sealed by prophecy. Achilles would be a hero. But heroes, Chiron knew, were not made for peace, only for remembrance. As Achilles grew into youth, his brilliance became impossible to hide. His strength rivaled that of seasoned warriors, and his beauty was almost divine. Too divine, in fact. For whispers of war began to spread across Greece, and the fates stirred restlessly. The prophecy had reached the ears of Thetis beneath the sea. If her son ever went to Troy, he would achieve eternal glory, but he would not return alive. The sea goddess could not bear to lose him to the destiny she herself had forged. So once more she rose from the depths, veiled in sorrow, to see her son. She found him on Mount Pelion, tall and fearless, his laughter ringing across the hills. When she told him of the prophecy, he only smiled. "If it is my fate," he said, "I will meet it proudly." But Thetis was not ready to surrender her child to death. Desperation breeds cunning. She disguised Achilles as a girl and took him to the island of Skyros, to the court of King Lycomedes. There, among the king's daughters, she hid him, dressing him in silks, teaching him to move softly and speak gently. The world's greatest warrior was disguised as a maiden, his armour replaced by embroidery, his voice subdued by fear and love. For a time, the ruse worked. The girls adored their mysterious companion, who was stronger, swifter, and far more graceful than any of them. Achilles went by the name Pyrrha, the red-haired one, and though he laughed at the charade, he obeyed his mother's wishes, for her sake, not his. But fate is not so easily deceived. When the Greek kings began mustering armies for Troy, the seer Calchas told them that the war could not be won without Achilles. Odysseus, ever the trickster, set out to find him. He arrived at Skyros disguised as a merchant, bringing jewels and fabrics for the maidens, but also a set of weapons, gleaming under the sun. When Achilles saw the sword, instinct overpowered disguise. His hand reached for the hilt, his stance hardened, and in that moment, Odysseus smiled. The charade was over. The hero had revealed himself. Thetis's deception had bought time, but not victory. The world was calling, and Achilles was ready to answer. Once discovered, there was no turning back. Odysseus, cunning as ever, spoke to Achilles not as a recruiter, but as a prophet of glory. "Troy," he said, "is the anvil on which legends are forged. Heroes will live and die there, but their names will echo for eternity. Will yours be among them?" The words struck something deep within Achilles, something older than fear, that fierce longing for greatness that no prophecy could quench. Thetis's pleas still lingered in his mind, her voice warning that he would never return. Yet Achilles was young, and immortality through fame burned brighter to him than immortality through safety. "Better a short life full of glory," he declared, "than a long one forgotten." And with that vow, he sealed his fate. Peleus, proud but mournful, gave his son his blessing. He sent for the armour Hephaestus had once forged for him, a gift from the gods now passed to their child. "Wear this," he said, fastening the greaves. "May it remind you that greatness carries weight." Achilles embraced his father for the last time, though neither spoke of death. Both men understood what could not be undone. Before leaving, Achilles returned once more to Chiron's cave on Mount Pelion. The old centaur, who had raised him, said nothing at first. He simply looked at his pupil, now taller, stronger, radiant with youth. Finally, Chiron broke the silence. "The path of the hero is not chosen," he said. "It is endured." Then he handed Achilles a spear carved from ash, balanced perfectly for his hand. "Remember what I taught you. Fight with purpose, not anger." When Achilles departed, the mountain wind seemed to mourn him. Down below, Odysseus and his fleet waited, sails taut against the sea breeze. As Achilles stepped aboard, the waves themselves rose in recognition, for the ocean still remembered his mother's touch. Behind him, Thetis wept beneath the waves. She had hidden him, begged the fates, defied Olympus itself. But nothing could silence destiny. Her son would go to Troy, and the world would remember his name forever. As the ship vanished over the horizon, the sun caught the bronze of his armour, and for a brief moment it seemed as though a star had descended to earth, burning, unstoppable, and already doomed. As the ships of Greece sailed toward Troy, a hush seemed to fall over the world. Even the gods paused, watching the spark of destiny blaze across the sea. Among the hundreds of warriors aboard, one shone brighter than all. Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, the child of prophecy, half mortal, half divine. The wind carried his name like a hymn. Heroes whispered it with awe, and kings envied it. He was not yet a man, but already legend trembled at his feet. On the journey, Odysseus studied him in silence. He had seen ambition before, but Achilles's was something else, a hunger that bordered on sacred. The young warrior spoke little, though when he did, his words burned with conviction. "Glory does not wait for those who hide," he said once. "It waits for those who meet their end without flinching." Even the seasoned generals fell quiet at that. Far below, beneath the waves, Thetis felt each gust of wind that filled his sails. She prayed to the gods who had betrayed her, begged them to protect her son. But she knew the truth. Destiny does not bend, even for a goddess. The fates had already spun the thread of Achilles' life, brilliant, short, and unbreakable. When the fleet reached Aulis, the priests made sacrifices to seek the favour of the winds. Flames rose, and smoke curled into omens. The seer Calchas spoke again. "The walls of Troy will not fall without the wrath of Achilles, and when his wrath burns out, so too will his life." Achilles listened, unshaken. There was no fear in him, only certainty. He looked toward the east, where the city of Troy waited, shining faintly on the horizon like a challenge from the gods themselves. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, he stood at the bow of the ship and whispered to the sea. "Mother," he said softly, "I will make you proud." The waves did not answer, but they glowed faintly in reply. The dawn that followed marked the beginning of the greatest war in mortal memory, and the rise of a hero who would never fade. Achilles was no longer just a son or student. He was destiny in motion, the mortal who would defy gods, embrace glory, and burn brighter than any flame the world had ever seen.